Thank you so much, Pina. I wanted to thank you, Pina, and other organizers, Connected Minds, CASE, for sponsoring this really fabulous event, very important event given the timeliness of the topics. Given the many hats that I wear, I did want to mention that I think it's really incredible in the spirit of the topic that we're covering right now in this panel. So I'm the interim director of Center for Integrative and Applied Neuroscience, CIAN, and there's a lot of overlap in our membership with CASE. And it really just speaks to how much collision or integration there is between technology, AI, and understanding the brain and figuring out ways to improve brain function, treat issues when we're faced with neurological conditions and so on. So I just thought I would give you a very quick overview of the neurotechnology, because there are a number of people in the room that I know are very familiar with these sorts of technologies, some who might have heard of them in the media and so on. So we thought we would start with the definition. Before I do that, I just wanted to let you know that I would consider myself technology and AI adjacent. Allison Sekuler here suggested this term, and I think it really applies to me. So I integrate technology into a lot of the work that I do. I'm actually trained as a clinical neuropsychologist. My research is also within the area of cognitive neuroscience. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology and Biology at York University, and I'm also an adjunct scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest. And a lot of my work focuses on aging and age-related disease and how to use technology and AI for that matter, to better come up with better ways of assessing, diagnosing, and treating some very complex issues that a very large portion of our population worldwide are dealing with. So with that, I hope this works. We do have some slides. I know this is a little bit different than some of the other panels, but we thought it would be important to introduce you to some of the questions and really define what we mean when we say neurotechnology. So what we're really referring to when we use the term neurotechnology is really any device that we use to study or measure and or modulate brain structure and function. And we need these devices in order to understand brain-behavior relationships, so how different parts of the brain support different thinking functions, our ability to feel, and so on, how we use these technologies to facilitate diagnosis of different types of brain disorders, using these technologies to provide neurofeedback on brain states. And this is used not only for treatments for brain disorders, but also for wellness. And I'm sure some of you have been consumers of these kinds of technologies. We'll speak about them here in this panel. Also treatment, as I mentioned already, treatment of disorders. There's some examples here: deep brain stimulation, that's DBS, and RTMS, which is repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. I've actually been listening to the radio and hearing commercials for TMS clinics, so these are really being used privately in clinics. And also to augment or alter its function. And so an example here is TCS. But you'll also hear, actually I'll show you a slide shortly, of a newer technology that is focused ultrasound, and it's being used now in a number of hospitals, including Sunnybrook here in Toronto. So I'm not going to go into detail with respect to this historical timeline, but we heard about inflection points, and you can see that the underpinnings of some of these ideas, AI, but especially some of the technologies, began in ancient times, and the evolution of these technologies is incredibly rapid, as I think many of you can appreciate, and it's really tough to keep up with the times, I think, and this is something that really spans all of the different panels. So really, what types of regulatory measures need to be put in place, and how do we deal with bringing these, the knowledge that we gain from certain technologies about the brain into legal practice, and so on. So hopefully we'll cover some of these topics amongst our panelists. We're going to actually return to this slide. It just showcases a few technologies in the last decade or so that have really become popular and are at the forefront of some of ways to understand brain function and help to correct brain function in situations when it's necessary to do so, and modulate brain function and help optimize our brain and our thinking. This is the example of focused ultrasound, and actually this image is from Sunnybrook, and it's actually an example of MR-guided ultrasound. So this technology, for example, has been used. I thought I had a slide showing a picture of a brain of somebody from who has Alzheimer's disease, has a diagnosis of probable Alzheimer's disease. It's been used to open the blood-brain barrier to deliver directly pharmaceutical treatment. It's really incredible what can be done. And by the way, these are it's a temporary opening of the blood-brain barrier. So just to be clear, but it's also been used as a directed treatment for conditions such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, for that matter. And here's an example of someone. I think Joe's going to play the video to the left, and so you can see someone with an essential tremor due to Parkinson's disease, and it's very debilitating, as you can imagine. It's only one of many symptoms that this individual experiences as a result of his diagnosis. And following MR-guided focused ultrasound, the next video will show you his remarkable
look over there.
recovery. So
Shayna, this video doesn't work.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a lag. Apologies. But look, he can even bring his fingers together.
It's working.
It's really remarkable. So look how far we've come. And I'm really excited to speak to the panel about all the implications of these. You know, we talk about optimism and pessimism. I mean, we're very optimistic. There are some reasons to be pessimistic, and we have to really find workable solutions to deal with potential misuses of these kinds of technologies and in combination with AI. So with that, I wanted to just, I'm just providing a very quick showcase of some of the societal implications and questions that arise from this emergence, this very rapid emergence of new technologies and AI to understand the brain and to help assess and treat brain disorders. So questions about whether all of these techniques are really, can they be used for the greater good, and how can they potentially be misused, cost of access. We heard actually in both panels issues about equity and access, and that's something that we'll cover in this panel. Legal implications, of course, some of data from some of these technologies is brought into the courtroom, and when can you use this information to determine criminal responsibility, healthcare implications, human enhancement, self-identity, and also just how to better educate scientists, the public, and so on these technologies. So it's really my privilege to introduce the panelists. We have some, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong monitor and I looked at the one that was delayed. So we have with us today, I'll start from my left. So Ian Stedman, who is Assistant Professor, Canadian Public Law and Governance at York University, School of Public Policy and Administration, Vice Chair of the Advisory Board of CIAN Institute of Genetics, Knowledge Mobilization Committee Lead of Connected Minds, and the Chair of Public Relations Committee, York Center for AI and Society, and a legal member of the Sick Kids Research Ethics Board. So we'll be hearing from Ian on issues relating to ethics and other legal matters. I have Susan Boehnke here, we have Susan Boehnke here, who is the Director of the NeuroTech Microcredentialing Program and the lead of our training committee at Connected Minds. She She's an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical and Molecular Sciences in the Center for Neuroscience Studies at Queen's University. Allison Sekuler, who I work very closely with, and who is the Sandra A. Rotman Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience at the Rotman Research Institute, President and Chief Scientist at the Baycrest Academy of Research and Education, President and Chief Scientist of the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, Professor of Psychology at University of Toronto, as well as at McMaster University. And we also have Padure, who is here with us from Intellijoint Surgical. He is the head of Regulatory Affairs, Quality Assurance, Healthcare Economics, and Market Access at Intellijoint. So unfortunately, Gunnar Blohm was meant to be here with us, but he's unfortunately under the weather. But he's here with us in spirit. He actually assisted with some of the slides. And I just wanted to begin now by having each of the panelists say a little bit more about themselves and tell us about their connection to neurotech and AI. So we'll begin with Ian.
Thank you. Works. Okay, good. So about a year ago, when Pina said, "Hey, guess what we've been doing at York?" and we've got this connected minds thing happening. That's when I became, like many of you in the room, that's when I became exposed to the neurotech. But I had already been working in the AI and AI governance space. Again, I'm a lawyer by training, went back and became a professor of public policy because I landed during the pandemic when the law schools weren't hiring, just saying. But it gives me a different perspective on these things that I think is really important too, kind of a critical analysis of the policy space, not just thinking about what laws exist and how do we apply them. My work with neuro has been kind of driven from, or it's at least emerged from, the work that I was already doing in the AI space. And so I'd written a book chapter for a book that Pina and Aviv back there put out a couple of years ago on AI in the legal profession. And the chapter was about the implications of artificial intelligence for legal ethics. So how many, just by show of hands, how many in the room are practicing lawyers? Yeah, a good chunk of you, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we started thinking about these things, it was we were probably a little bit ahead of the actual curve of these technologies being adopted into practice, but now we see AI tools all over the practice of law. In fact, they keep popping up, and it's a very innovative space. So I was at an OBA conference, Tech Expo, and I was sitting there, and Amy Salazin, who is a professor at University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, who's a legal ethics expert, she was giving a keynote on AI and the legal profession, and we were sitting there at lunch, and she said, "What are you up to?" And I said, "Well, Pina's got this thing happening, and we're getting involved in connected minds and neuro." And she said, "Well, in the UK, the regulator just put out this massive report at the end of November, or 2022, 2023, saying neuro is the next frontier, what we have to start to worry about in the legal profession." And so today, that's the kind of space where I want to focus my remarks, is kind of leveraging what we've been thinking about in the AI space and asking ourselves, what can we learn from what AI has been teaching us in the legal profession to kind of map that onto where we think neurotech might impact us as lawyers as we practice law. So that's kind of the angle I want to bring to our discussion.
Thank you. Okay, Susan.
Great. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm Susan Boehnke. I'm a professor at Queen's University, and I've been working with and fascinated with neuroscience and neurotech for 20 plus years. I was very much a basic neuroscientist, working in the lab, working with these kinds of tools that we're going to talk about today, recording from single neurons in the brains of awake behaving animals, doing neuroimaging studies, carefully monitoring behavior. And as time went on the last 20 years, I started to see how all of these tools that we thought were just our special tools in the lab were starting to be used and translated into society in ways that kind of surprised me. For instance, being used in marketing, to which I would say, how do they think they know what's going on in someone's brain when we think we're on the cutting edge and we're not sure we're not sure we understand it. People being used in law, as we'll talk about now. Brain imaging data coming into the courtroom. How are judges and jurors supposed to evaluate this kind of evidence? And so I started to teach about these things in our fourth year neuroscience courses, and started to get more interested in these neuroethical issues about how neuroscience tools are being used in society. And that is really how I came to developed this NeuroTech Microcredential program. It really came out of this realization as I tried to engage with faculty and other experts in law, in sociology, and in other disciplines. I realized how little they understood about the brain and how little neuroscientists understood about regulation and policy and legal issues. And I thought, we really all ought to be talking together a little bit more. So I applied to SSHRC and got funding to host a conference called the NeuroTech Future, Ethical, Legal, and Policy Issues. And that's where we brought people from industry, from government, all to the table, along with faculty from across campus for a real transdisciplinary conversation. And from that, we sort of talked about the lack of educational opportunities to actually do this kind of transdisciplinary training. And it was right when the Ontario government announced a Microcredential Challenge Fund, and that is how that came to be. So I bring, I guess, that to the picture, and hopefully I'll pass this on to you.
So, Allison. Hi, I'm Allison Sekuler, and I am, again, wearing lots and lots of different hats. I have been a cognitive neuroscientist since before the field of cognitive neuroscience actually existed. I was actually at the very first Cognitive Neuroscience Institute school,
Wow.
which was at Harvard.
That's great.
So we sort of created that whole field. And what cognitive neuroscience does is to help you try to figure out what's going on inside someone's head without having to cut their head open, which is a useful thing to do. Over the years, my work has evolved so that I've become what you refer to as AI adjacent. So I don't develop new AI models, for example, but I do quite a lot of work in the AI space. I think you suggested AI ally is another good term. I was the Canadian chair for the UK-Canada scheme on responsible AI in 2019, and I chair the NSERC Public Value Impact Proposition Committee, which for the Alliance Society, and I would say almost every single grant that comes through has to do with using AI for societal good, which is a terrific idea. In my role as a scientist, we're really, really excited about how we can use all the different forms of AI to help older people live their best lives. That's really what our goal is how do we make sure that we live in a world where every older adult lives a life of inspiration and passion and dignity. And we think that the way to get there is by adding AI and neurotechnology together and having all of these different kinds of technologies and tools colliding. So that's what we're excited about. And what we want to do really is to do with precision medicine for aging what precision medicine did for cancer, and we're calling it precision aging. But instead of focusing just in therapeutics and detection, we really want to go across the entire span from prevention through detection, through therapeutics and treatment, through care. And I think that the panel that we'll be talking about, we're going to touch on some of those issues, and especially how pulling together all of the different kinds of neurotechnologies along with different AI approaches that Shayna talked about at the beginning. When you put them all together, the power is really just unstoppable. The last thing I'll just mention is because of my role leading the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, or CABI, which currently is funded in addition to the Government of Ontario. It's also funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and soon ICED also, when we were part of the Strategic Science Fund. We work with innovators across the entire innovation spectrum, from designing and developing all the way through making equity investments in companies. I would say almost every single one of those is touching this collaboration between neurotech and AI in some way. And it's just really exciting to see where we're going and how what we thought was impossible just 5 years ago is now possible. So I really believe, for example, we will be able to have a world by 2050 where no new people are being diagnosed with dementia, no one is moving into a long-term care home because of dementia, and no one is dying from dementia. And I think that's only possible because of neurotechnology and AI.
Thank you, Allison. Very much upset. And Andre?
That kind of optimistic approach, I don't know if this is working or not.
that kind of optimistic approach that Allison has is one that I take to artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation in general. I've been working in the field at the intersection of regulatory affairs specifically and healthcare and medical devices for the past 15 years, specifically at the intersection of regulatory affairs and highly invasive medical devices, IVDs, and NeuroTech falls highly in that category. Specifically, my interest in my professional career has grown early on as a lawyer, later on transitioning away from practice to working in the private sector on how AI can be best leveraged to tangibly improve clinical outcomes in both patients of my current employer, but patients of former consulting clients that I've had and legal clients. AI has not just contributed towards improved outcomes over the past 15 years and the evolution of, let's be honest, the evolution of automation to now multi-generational, multimodal, generative artificial intelligence. It's also improved and challenged the regulatory framework significantly over the past few years. And I will be the proponent to say that there are regulatory frameworks that currently exist in our day-to-day functioning that wholeheartedly apply to artificial intelligence-based products or powered devices. However, our reluctance perhaps to apply them is a bit high at the moment. But bringing it all back to why we're all sitting on this panel here, the impact of AI on NeuroTech specifically has been of immeasurable effect. And over the next, I think, 5-10 years, as regulation becomes a little bit more refined, I think innovation is going to increase exponentially in line with that refinement of regulation.
Thank you so much. So I'm actually going to go back a couple of slides because my next question really has to do with what types of new developments excite you, and also what kinds of challenges do you believe are being brought to the table with respect to those exciting developments on the positive side. So Susan is going to begin and maybe touch on some of the technologies that you see here on the screen.
Yeah, so I put this timeline together for one of my courses, and I just, it's based off of actually a recent publication that highlighted just how incredible the proliferation of neurotech devices has been in the last 15 years or so. I guess you can go back to Toronto, a startup called Interaxon, 2007, just down the road from here, really, that created the Muse headband, which was the first commercially available EEG device for basically neurofeedback. And they pitched it as a way to enhance your meditation practice, which it does, because we do know from basic neuroscience that your brain waves do change when you go into a meditative state. So they exploited that. So this is, you can see this girl at the bottom, we're in this. There are a whole bunch of devices in this consumer space now that do something similar. Some are based out of various types of headphones, because the whole thing is who's going to want to actually wear something like this. So they're trying to integrate it into earbud headphones. That's a company called iDone. There's another one called Neurable that just had the top prize or an innovation prize at the Consumer Electronics Show this past year, and they have it built into the electrodes built into the over-the-ear headphones. More importantly, probably, is brain-computer interfaces to help people with disabilities like paralysis or late-stage ALS, people that can no longer move at all. So think about someone like Stephen Hawking. If you could put let's take his example, because that's actually a good start. So how did Stephen Hawking communicate? Does anyone remember? He basically was able to create, either he could use his eyes tracking, but he also actually used a little cheek muscle that was one of the only muscles he had left that worked. And he could then control a cursor that basically jumped around to various pre-made bits of text. And he had one of the first predictive text kind of computers that we all now use all the time with our iPhones. So that was how he communicated. It was slow. Imagine if he could just think what he wanted to say in his head, like imagine himself speaking it, and it could have been translated. Well, things weren't there before he died, but they're getting there now. In fact, we have, using this, we'll start with the Utah array, which was from a company called BlackRock from Utah. They created this array that you could put into, we use these in animal experiments all the time in our labs. So, but then they started through the BrainGate trials actually implanting these, and this was years and years ago, into people with paralysis, and then using their brain signals from their motor cortex to control, say, a robotic arm. And this obviously wasn't done in some direct fashion. There was an AI or machine learning algorithms built in to the interface that were interpreting the signals and then controlling the robot. And then the person that had the implant was learning alongside the algorithm. So in a way, in order to translate this into movement. And then most recently, if we're going to talk about neuroprosthetics, is the speech neuroprosthetics. That's not particularly on here, but that's using ECOG arrays, for instance, or it could be using something like the Utah array. And this is where they were able to actually, it might seem like mind reading, but it's really speech decoding. But for people who've lost the ability to speak, to be able to actually have them imagine saying the words, and then the computer is able to interpret those neural signals and actually turn them into text or into a robotic voice. So there's that. Then there's also all sorts of non-invasive things in this space, such as what's going on with Kernel, which is basically this fancy fNIRS device that can do kind of like fMRI brain imaging, but without having to go into a magnet. You have all these innovations happening with material science, with creating better, more biocompatible electrodes, and this just goes on. Did that help?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, that's an excellent overview. And actually, if others have anything to add, I'm looking at Allison because I know that you're working with some exciting devices as well. I see you have one of the devices that Susan spoke about.
Oh, did she bring a news?
Yeah, so this...
We need a volunteer.
So this is, you can see very far on the left is the first generation Muse, and this is a more recent version.
The Muse S.
The Muse S. Yeah.
We have a whole pile of these in the lab.
Yeah. This one was designed specifically for sleep. It has a very soft headband. Yeah.
Actually, he's the perfect, without the hair, you're the perfect subject for this.
And it has actually, you can measure your heart rate and how you're moving and all these kinds of things. You can flop this right into the wash, keep this off. It has EEG just built right into it. So in my lab, I use a 256 electrode EEG system. It takes like 20 to 30 minutes just to put the thing on someone's head. With these sorts of things, whether it's the original type of Muse, the headband, or this, you can instantly do it. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is you mentioned IDEN. So actually, I mentored IDEN when they were in the CDL program last year.
I saw. One of my students from Queens it works there now.
Yeah,
so I talked to her
it's
about
great
it.
because what they do is they're using the EEG built into earphones basically, and that is what gets me excited. Is this particular device you can wear it while you're sleeping, so not just for a short period of time. But where we're going to get is that these sorts of devices will basically be like your Apple Watch or your AirPods or whatever wearables that you're going to have all the time. In fact, Interaxon already created one of these versions with Smith glasses, that they had a glasses version of this. So, and if you think about where it is the newest generation of the Air XR system is going to be, with Apple Vision Pro. I was out there last year talking to them actually about IDEN and why they ought to be integrating that into their systems. That's where we're going to end up. Those are just going to look like your glasses. Those are going to be integrated with not just headphones that can help you hear things, but will be measuring all these different sort of biometrics while you're just walking around. And for me, it sounds a little creepy maybe, but for me it gets me excited because the Apple Watch already is able to get so much information. We've got all these wearables, and once we have people living with these sorts of devices, we can get into these closed-loop systems where, to your point, we can not only be having it measuring things for us, but it can be improving our life. So if you think about, for example, a scenario where you've got somebody who has mild cognitive impairment and needs to go shopping, but they can't really remember things. You can imagine that they will be able to have the mind reading sorts of things that Susan was talking about. And in augmented reality, it will be highlighting for the person what it is that they need to buy at the supermarket. It can give them a nutritional analysis of why they should get this versus that to keep them healthier and have good brain health food. And at the same time, if they see somebody that they can't remember, it will whisper in their ear, oh, that's Pina, the last time you saw her was this, and give her little hints so that you're more able to socially engage. So we can imagine how through the combination, the collision of technologies, that's what's exciting for me, of these neurotechnological devices, these sorts of building in the information you're getting from the Internet of Things, all of the biometrics, et cetera, it's just going to be changing every element of our life. And people talk about like this, it's body and brain. It's actually body-brain building. So let's say you fall asleep on the couch. Your house will know, and it will lower the temperature, and it will turn off your TV, so we don't have to worry about wasting energy and so on. So that's, I think, what I'm really excited about. And it sounds like science fiction, but we are headed there. CABI is funding projects in those spaces right now. It's phenomenal, again, where we're headed.
Excellent. And I guess Andre, you want to speak to these questions, whether something about.
I want to chime in with a different kind of benefit that is already happening as a result of the introduction of AI, not just on the outcome, on the output of the device itself, but during the actual design and development of these devices. Companies are sitting in this space where, unlike other areas, other industries, in the healthcare space, we are tightly regulated. That is just the nature of the business, and rightly so, because these things end up in our brain. We want to ensure that the devices are safe and effective, but to be able to manufacture devices that are safe and effective, the cost burden is incredibly high, particularly when it comes to biocompatibility and the actual material generation and design of these devices. It can be incredibly cost prohibitive. Manufacturers like BrainLab in Germany and some Canadian manufacturers are already using artificial intelligence to better determine and predict the outcomes of biocompatibility testing and actual design of the devices. And this is, I think, perhaps not a very sexy part of AI, but it makes such a big difference in the actual tangible product that we end up with at the end of a development cycle that we might not always see.
Excellent point. Ian, did you want to speak to
I do work in the health space too, but this is fascinating to me. As I've said, I'm kind of adjacent, so listening to what's actually happening on the cutting edge is amazing. But I was also thinking about clinical encounters when you go see your doctor. There's so many things that happen to you, and you have to kind of discern what's relevant to put it out there for your physician, for them to figure out what's wrong with you. And this idea that the things that could be swirling around inside that you may never verbalize could still be accessible as information for someone who needs that information. That's fascinating. That really opens up some crazy opportunities in health, but also in the legal space, right? For evidence, for cross-examination, for understanding witnesses who might not remember what they've seen. There's just so many really socially important potential implications of these technologies.
I think we got to be careful with that.
Yeah.
On the legal side.
Pull it back. Good.
Well, no, just that, and that memory is a very funny thing. Eyewitness testimony, as you know, the problem is with memory and the fact that we rewrite our memories all the time. So just having access to the tech isn't going to magically stop that.
Good. Okay. Good.
I don't think so, at least.
But I'm not
It's
scared.
my take.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to pick up on that exact point. And, it's really how do we use these data? So we're gathering all this we're gathering rich data. for instance, can use functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at activity across the brain, and we might think that that pattern relates to a particular function, tells us something about how the brain's working well and maybe not working so well. But certainly this information can be misused, and sometimes there's incidental findings. I mean, you can think about, if you went to your doctor and you went for one issue and they noticed something else, it might not actually be significant, but they still need to follow up. This, of course, happens when we're scanning people, when we're using other kinds of technologies. So if anybody wants to speak to these issues of how to use the data that we're collecting and whether really it's open to misuse, or maybe open more to misuse than some other situations.
I think it's good to point out that it's kind of trendy in the US right now to have full body MRI scans just to see if anything's wrong. I think most doctors in Canada cringe at this, partly because, of course, we have to pay for all the incidental findings that get found, which may or may not be a problem at all. So there's ethical issues about having easy access, I think, to things like MRI scans.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly there are challenges. I think we're going to talk more about that in the next panel, but I think that the benefits really just outweigh those challenges. As long as we're aware of what the issues are. And I think that the other thing that's happening is that, I mean, you saw from this kind of a system, which is mentioned, you don't have to have these in the lab anymore. These can now be in people's homes. And even MRI, there's now portable MRI that, so it's not as sensitive, if you will, as the sorts of systems that you go to in the doctor's office. But we can now drive it into the communities. And what that does is, there was talk about democratizing AI in one of the other panels. And I think that what this does is it affords us an opportunity to be able to bring, whether it's for research or whether it's for clinical purposes, to bring these sorts of devices into the communities and into communities that never necessarily had access. So I was just up in the Yukon earlier this week. And the people in Carmax, for example, there's not even a neurologist in the Yukon. So forget about getting to have MRIs all the time like you can in Toronto. But now if we can bring the devices there and you can sort of get a regular brain checkup like you would an eye check once a year, you'll be able to detect these things a lot earlier and prevent more diseases going forward. And I really think that the opportunity for us to be able to, as long as it's done in a culturally safe way, obviously, the opportunity to share these kinds of innovations with broader populations that usually are vulnerable and underrepresented, the benefits, I think, are really going to outweigh the concerns, if we're aware of them.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point about, especially in a country like Canada, we have huge geographic inequities in access to these kinds of tech. If you're in Toronto, you're doing great. You can have your functional ultrasound at Sunnybrook. You can have all the best neurosurgeons to implant your DBS electrodes for whatever disorder you have. That is not something that is equally accessible across the country by any stretch. We only recently in Kingston, for instance, got a functional neurosurgery unit to even attempt DBS. Just imagine in the north. And a great example about the swoop. So this is the portable MRI. At Queen's, we cover Moose Factory, and that's a territory up there, I guess James Bay. And then, but they had no access to anything. People have to be airlifted down to Kingston General for any kind of imaging or anything like that. And now with the swoop, we can at least rule out whether somebody's had a stroke or a kid has hydrocephalus before they have to be removed from their communities. So it's going to go a long way to make those things more equally accessible.
Thank you for touching on that. That actually was an issue that I was hoping to cover, equity and access, and I'm wondering from a legal perspective whether Ian or Andre, do you have anything to add or maybe to rip off of that?
I have lots. I'm just not quite sure how far I should go. Particularly because I'm going to use soup as an example. Because soup as a manufacturer, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, the actual machine is about yay big, maybe yay tall, and it is absolutely life-saving However, even though this machine is so small and I would say significantly more accessible than a traditional MRI, it is still cost prohibitive. It is an expensive piece of equipment that is genuinely life-saving, particularly for our most remote communities. And outside of my regular professional career, I sit on the Access to Medicines and Health Products Commission at the World Health Organization. My commitment to public health equity is quite strong, and it influences a lot of my work and a lot of everything that I do, really. So when I see technology that is so advanced and so beneficial to the community at large, my first instinct is, what influence do I have to enable that technology to be more readily available? And legal frameworks, be whatever they may, should be changed to accommodate for that access. Yeah. And that is, but I understand that is my one singular opinion, and perhaps, commercial interests will definitely outweigh that, but it is, it should be at the core of what drives the evolution of the regulatory framework and the legal framework of AI, particularly in the neurotech space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just make that point, the hyperfine swoop device is what we're talking about, is only able to do this kind of MRI imaging with AI-based image analysis.
Exactly.
That's how they solved the problem of not requiring a 3 Tesla magnet that took up a huge amount of a specially shielded room, etc.
We did not coordinate this, by the way. No one is paying us for that.
Ian, did you want to add to this?
In the legal space, when AI first started gaining a lot of attention, there was a really good conversation about the potential it had to kind of improve access to justice, right? And that was even before these LLMs became so ubiquitous that you could. So there's a really important, I think, role for AI to play within that space. And I'm just thinking about layering on the neurotechnology, the ways in which you could improve people's lives, and then now also give them access to information that they can use without, having to have a law degree to know what kind of question to ask. I think it's really powerful to think about that. So from the regulatory perspective, if I'm thinking about the regulatory body that is the Law Society of Ontario or the other law societies, there are active conversations that have to be had about how do we make sure that these tools can be out there and can be used in a way that improves people's access to the legal profession, but they're not out there holding themselves out to be providing legal services, which is the same kind of conversation we're having in healthcare with the regulated health professions. There's all sorts of tools that can do all sorts of wonderful things, but if we call them a wellness device instead of a health device, then we don't have to regulate them the same way. And those are important conversations for us to have about where the risks will lie in being too light with our regulatory touch in order to get them out there, to get them used, versus not protecting people enough, right? So for example, an app that you use to help you with your mental health episodes or to give you feedback, the app may be designed to be wellness, right? It'll direct you towards resources. But at some point, someone is going to say to that chat bot, I feel like killing myself. And it's not good enough for the person who designed it and put it on the market to say, yeah, but that's not what it's for. It's a wellness app. It's just going to direct them towards resources. But that may not be what people use it for. And I think that would be the really hard part of regulating in these spaces, is that it's not always going to be what we intended for it, is what it gets used for, right?
The other issue, and this is what we were talking about earlier, is the ability for the physicians and others in the care sector to actually have the courage to adopt these things in the face of the different regulations. There's a lot of discussion going on in the Ontario Hospital Association and across Canada around, especially AI models aren't like fixed and then they stay the same. They're evolving over time as they learn more. So when you've got adaptive AI, and now you link that in with health, whether it's neurotechnology or other kinds of health, if something goes wrong, who's responsible, right? And I think that there's, I don't know, Andrew, if you want to talk about this a little bit more, but there's a huge reticence amongst clinicians to adopt anything in this space. I mean, we were talking about you still are having to send notes by fax to some of your friends, right, who are in the medical field. Because that works, they know that works, they know there's no law against that, and there's this risk that they're taking by adopting anything new. So I'm just wondering what your view on that from the regulatory perspective.
A couple of points on specifically on facts. Specifically, if you are friends with actual practicing physicians, please discourage them from using fax. I think so many of our prescriptions are still sent via fax to our pharmacies. It is so embedded in our healthcare system that sometimes it's just, at some point it becomes comical. But on the actual technology itself, every single piece of medical technology, actually I'm not quite sure if this is a medical device or not, but every single piece of medical technology is required to have something that's called intended use and indications for use. Those intended use and indications for use are typically speaking quite rigid and very, very strict. AI completely disrupts the framework of intended use and indications for use, because those indications can drastically expand as AI models learn. And what we've been seeing both on panels that I sit at in private sector and in the public sector is that from a medical professional's perspective, there is a reluctance to adopt if we do not know what the limits are. There is a reluctance to intake information without knowing what the final output is, particularly when it comes to IVDs, in vitro diagnostic devices, that will output a level of result or an interpretation of perhaps a test result. And what we're seeing now, particularly in cases of some types of leukemia, for example, are a long game. Your diagnosis can last for as long as 20 years. And it is a very, very slow progressing, multiple types of slow progressing leukemias. However, there have been incidences of IVDs that have flagged and recommended initial drastic treatment as a result of just slight elevations in your blood work. Those things are alarming if you do not have that diagnosis, but if you do have that diagnosis, well, actually, that's okay, you're doing well. But it requires human interpretation. And there have been recalls over the past couple of years on generative AI models, particularly in the in vitro diagnostic space, that have contributed to, I think, a health professional's reluctance to adopt technology specifically. And as a collective, both between government and private sector, we all have, I believe, a responsibility to more appropriately conduct risk management activities, so that we can provide our regulators with more robust intended use and indications for use statements, but also really, really robust use case scenarios and even low levels of clinical evidence. If those activities aren't done, we're not going to be able to build up the confidence to increase adoption.
Excellent, and I think that point is extremely important, and I actually have been thinking about, I don't know what term you use, but collective technologies, or using these technologies in combination, which really seems colliding technologies. I love that term. And as you saw, with focused ultrasound, for example, it's MR guided, so you're using an MRI with ultrasound together. It's necessary to bring these things together in order to deliver a therapeutic. But I can imagine a situation, I think others could, where two different technologies provide discrepant results. So how do you deal with that? And I'm curious if this is something that anybody's thought about. That, and I guess another question relates also to data output and privacy, so you can choose which one you want to speak to, and then we can go from there.
I can maybe start and go to Jen, and just I'll speak from the perspective of, say, early detection of something, and you're not always going to get the same answer. You won't always get the same answer from one test. So, for example, COVID is rampant right now. I can't tell you how many people I hear say, I have a fever, I have a sore throat, I've got this and that, but I tested, and I'm negative for COVID. It's like, okay, probably tested wrong, first of all. And secondly, you tested too early. And thirdly, there's different kinds of tests. If you have converging evidence, 100% you've got COVID, right? And it makes a difference because you want to treat it differently, but regardless. Same thing with the early detections, for example, of dementia. There are going to be different kind of tools that are going to work differently for people. And so this is when we're talking about colliding technologies. This is another form of collision, which is bringing multiple forms of information into one model, right? So the multimodal sort of AI approaches. So one company that we work with called ReadySpec out of Toronto, basically you can take a picture of the back of your eye when you go to your eye doctor, and it can predict if you're headed toward dementia. And that's the bottom line. Now, if you have certain kinds of, is it 100%? No. And if you have certain sorts of eye disorders or something, it's not going to work as well. It may not work as well for certain eye colors, and so on and so forth. Right? You might have another sort of a model. In fact, we have just filed a patent using something like Muse to be able to predict based on your EEG and vision testing. Are you headed toward dementia? It's not going to work for everybody, but it will work some of the time. Other people are looking at eye movements. Other people are looking at other kinds of things. Blood tests are coming. But if you can put them now all together, I think that's when you really have the most confidence. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we've seen in my work working with companies is that they get so attached to the one modality and their one innovation that the idea that they'll be collaborating with others is a challenge. But that's where we're going to see the real power, is when you put them all together. You're never going to get 100% correct answers from any one of them. So you're absolutely going to get conflicting advice. You need to put them all together, is my bet.
A great example is like detecting amyloid in the brain. Does not predict Alzheimer's 100%.
Right.
Because lots of people can have amyloid plaques in their brain and not have any symptoms of dementia whatsoever. So you can't use these things as entirely predictive.
And I guess it seemed unconnected, but given the amount of data that are produced, just curious about privacy and how do we deal with, this is an issue that relates to all different types of technologies, not just neurotechnology and AI, but how do we deal, especially when it comes to health-related applications of these technologies, but also commercial applications.
So we have privacy frameworks. There's an active dialogue all across this country about whether we need to modernize our privacy frameworks. We have not yet done that. But that's not to say we don't actually have frameworks in place. The real challenge, the timidity that people have about this space, is more about cybersecurity. Right? If you're doing privacy right, and you have a proper terms of service with your app, and you know where the data is going to be stored, that's fine. We're not actually reinventing the wheel there. The challenge right now is the technology by the bad actors is so much worse than the technology. And this comes back to our keynote, right? Our public sector needs to get better at doing the things that will bring us into the digital age. And regulating these technologies is another bit, right? The Medical Devices Directorate of Health Canada, do you know how many people work there who assess medical devices applications? 9.
That's it?
Yeah.
On a good day.
And
But they don't
Allison is in charge of the AI file. That's how it's working right now for medical devices in Health Canada. But again, there's something we talked about around the lunch table is, if you're coming out of university and you're really skilled and you're really good at this stuff and you're innovative, the money in the private sector far outweighs the money the public sector is going to throw at you. And so how do we get the capacity in our public sector? Right? You're going to have some people who are public service driven, but a lot of people want to pay their student loans back. And the higher you go in your education pathway, right, the more skilled you get, usually the more debt you've accumulated for most, right? And that's one of the, I think, interesting tensions that we have to address at the public sector level in order to create the capacity to regulate these spaces and maybe finally get to modernizing privacy laws, right? What you don't want is for every one of us who downloads an app or uses a new device to have to become a privacy expert. You want there to be some baseline standards in place that will make sure the industry protects us as a status quo, right? That they aren't just going to take our data and use it for whatever purposes they want because we agreed to that in the terms. Right now it's just the model is consent is a contract. And if you and I don't know how to read the contract because we don't, it's click wrap. we say yes and we download the app. What choice do we have? But maybe there needs to be some sort of conversation about making sure that we don't have to be the ones to protect ourselves, as complex as these spaces are getting, right?
And it's also, of course, predicting what might be, what the data might be used for. It's very difficult to foresee. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
I just wanted to bring up the fact that for regulatory affairs, it's really difficult to get any kind of training. So if you're a neuroscientist or entrepreneur and you want to understand regulation, it's really opaque.
I will.
And why should it only be lawyers? Like, why shouldn't we have in that public service neuroscientists or someone with a neuroscience degree that gets some kind of a master's in regulatory affairs and at least can then provide both lenses?
At least in our industry, there is only one postgraduate degree at a university level, and it's from a non-Canadian university at Northeastern University. I'm not even sure. I think it's an online university or something. That is the only actual academic program in regulatory affairs.
University of Southern California had one.
Oh, it is?
It was actually created by 2 Canadians that came from Queens. I totally didn't know about it.
Oh, I had no idea. Yeah. That is the only regulatory affairs program that exists in our space. That is it. There are a couple of programs at Seneca and Algonquin, I think, in quality assurance specifically for our spaces. But for regulatory affairs, I mean, it took me a master's, an MBA, and a law degree to be able to wrap my head around, and $280,000 of student debt by the time I finished. And that was the. I don't want to call it a sacrifice, but it almost was. And as a result of that, I did end up going into the private sector, of course, because that's just what happens.
And I was going to suggest going the other way, right? Because, and maybe this comes back to your micro-credentialing program. It's great having folks in the public service who have a background, understanding, interest of love in science, but there are very, very few, relatively speaking, people who go into the public service, especially within like MPs and ministers and so on, that really understand and love that science. And so why not also do the opposite, which is to take people who are already in those sectors and make sure that everybody has science literacy and neurotech literacy and AI literacy. And it doesn't mean they have to get a whole degree in it, right? CFAR has, I don't know where at least one, but there's an online micro-credentialing program, just give people a general introduction to AI, right? And you guys have the NeuroTech micro-credentialing. We're doing micro-credentialing of all sorts for older people so that they can advise innovators better. So why not, rather than have to go back and get full degrees and everything, why not build on this micro-credentialing opportunity?
Yeah. That'd be great. So you can find us at neurotechmicrocreds.com. At any rate, anyone from anywhere can join.
You should do a legal one targeting the
yes,
legal
neuro law.
session.
So actually, that's one of the ones I think we want to do. It's one on neuro law through Connected Minds. But I'm going to need Osgood to help me with that. I'm looking at you.
That actually, excellent segue. We were very curious about how to best train the next generation. And there are many students here from a variety of disciplines, and we often get siloed in the way that we learn. And Connected Minds, to put a plug, is really built to bring different disciplines together and to allow us for this kind of education. But just wondering if there are other ingredients that we should be mindful of. So if anybody wants to comment, I think Susan, you're touching on this with the micro-credentialing program.
Yeah, no, I always believed that we needed to have space. So when I first started to get interested in this space, I basically reached out to anyone I could find within Queens. So I went into the law school. Who would have known there was a law professor, Martha Bailey, that actually taught a course on neuroscience and the law, and none of us in neuroscience knew about that. There was people in surveillance studies that were very interested in the advent of neurotech, whether there would be surveillance on thought, whether there would be surveillance on just other behaviors, and they were very interested in this space. Neither of them knew, that law professor had actually done a master's in neuroscience during a sabbatical, but people shouldn't have to do a master's in neuroscience in order to just get brought up to the space. In fact, that's probably not going to teach you what you need to know, particularly for neurotech. So I guess this is why I came up with the idea of the Microcredential program. It was really to try to predict this place where we're going to have experts, engineers, and lawyers that have gaps in their understanding in this space. And how do we fill them without making people go back for graduate degrees?
And I would just, going back to the last panel, I think it's really important also to make sure we don't forget about the role of the arts in all of this, because I'm biased, I have to say, with cards on the table. I went to a very small liberal arts college in California called Pomona College, where you can do things like double major in mathematics and psychology and have unofficial minors in English and fine arts. It's very difficult to do in the Canadian system or the UK system. But what it does for you is, again, it's a little bit more than a micro-credential, but it gives you an understanding of how to speak different languages and to be able to see, to your point, how the different elements should be connecting. So instead of having, a wall between, the arts and science and business, it allows you to sort of speak multiple languages, if you will, to find those connections amongst them. And I think that in the neurotech space in particular, neurotech, health, and so on, the arts is sort of woven throughout that, because whether it's gamifying something, whether it's the work that's happening in AR, VR, XR, whether it's there's so much work in music, for example, in aging and dementia, and therapy, art therapy, and so on, theater. I mean, it's woven throughout everything. And so if there's not an understanding of those sorts of languages and how it all fits together, I think we're really going to be missing out. The world won't be nearly as interesting.
Yeah, just to see how these things collide. I have an engineering physics student, which I never thought in a million years I would ever attempt to supervise, but he came to me because I met him through a student club. And he's doing his fourth-year project using EEG in my lab to try to basically be able to control a keyboard so that someone with a disability could make music.
That's incredible.
That's incredible.
Curious about, so there's, education obviously within our disciplines in a university setting. We also touched, I think some of you touched on co-creation and the need to bring in, and this is something that, we're really trying to, we really value at York, and I know at other universities, there's some representatives here, but this need to bring in stakeholders, key stakeholders, the end user, others who might be affected by neurotechnology, for instance, and AI. So if those on the panel would like to comment on how we can maybe optimize co-creation and the importance of it.
Yeah, there was, this morning, I think both Sari and Dean Farrow mentioned how in the law schools they were very alive to the fact that they need to have a very active conversation about how to get law students understanding the technology. And I don't think this is the kind of co-creation you're imagining with the question, but to an extent, lawyers who advise their clients are kind of creating their imaginations as to what the limits are of what they can do with their businesses, with their technologies. And so maybe just to come back to my turn to plug, the stuff that I'm doing is, like, if you're a practicing lawyer, just like any technology, if it's out there and it's pretty ubiquitous, you're going to want to understand how you can benefit from it within your own practice. But you're also going to want to understand how it's being used outside, your own practice, so you can advise on the implications of those technologies. There are active conversations about neuro rights happening all around the world. What are the implications of actually monitoring brain activity, and what does that mean for people? There are states who have made changes to their constitutional structures. Chile, has made changes to infuse neuro rights in them. So those are interesting conversations that we probably will be having as the technology advances. If you Google how are lawyers using neurotech, you'll see that lawyers who are doing jury trials are doing trials on potential, like they're doing moot arguments. They're fake arguments where they monitor the attention of their fake jurors to see, when I say A, B, and C, does their brainwave activity go up or down? Am I losing them? Are they staying with me? Think about that as a competitive advantage. So you're going to want to understand how the technologies work,
Like
what's coming out.
Marketing for jury selection. God.
No, but like you could see, I've watched American television. I know that there's whole shows based on jury selection, right?
Oh my God.
So you're going to want to be acquainted with it. You're going to want to know how you can augment your practice. There's going to be ways in which these techs are used for stimulation or keeping you alert, right?
So I really enjoyed this panel discussion. It was superb. Ian, when you started off and said that neuro is the next frontier at the intersection of AI and the legal practice that in the tech space that really captured my Allison said that she predicts that by 2050, people who have dementia, they're following like this. And I really enjoyed these considerations around the privacy, data security. One area that you touch on is the notion of agency, autonomy, and informed consent. So if we could imagine kind of brain-computer interfaces maybe they already exist, or maybe in the very near future, that can actually make decisions on behalf of a user based on a predicted outcome or an algorithm. And I'm thinking now, because of the dementia application case, like, what does that actually mean?
Early in January of this year, the World Health Organization published a guiding document about 100 pages long on a proposed data governance and ethics framework for artificial intelligence. Obviously, it's non-binding, it's an international body, it's going to trickle its way down through international governments, but as part of this guiding document, they identified 8 risks of artificial intelligence that the Director General sees and the entire Access to Medicine and Healthcare Products group sees as risks. The 8th one was preserving the epistemic authority of humans. That was the 8th identified risk of artificial intelligence by the World Health Organization. And it still sits with me ever since I first read the guidance document, because I don't think it's been talked about enough yet.
Maybe just give a couple of examples.
A couple of examples. So I can think of, in terms of having brain-computer interfaces. So you can imagine that some of the regulatory issues that come up. So let's just give the example of Second Sight, which was a cautionary tale of lack of regulation. So this is a company that had created retinal implants, sort of analogous to a cochlear implant. How many people know someone with a cochlear implant? Probably lots. Yeah, I do too. And that's great. So imagine you have one for vision. Would be great too. You have this camera system. But now you imagine you're a startup company and you're running a trial, and people are implanted with your trial, and they're getting their health care, and they're getting their device dealt with by you. And then COVID hits, and you go out of business and bankrupt and go dark. And now you have all these people running around with these things implanted in their eyes that they can't get out. Okay, so what did they consent to? They consented to have it implanted and to participate in the trial. They didn't consent to not having access to a way to get it out. And then on the counterpoint to that, there was an example of a woman in Australia, I think, just talking about agency, sense of self, who had epilepsy, and she had had a special experimental implant in that could detect her seizures. And that really helped her regulate her lifestyle, and she suddenly could go out in the world, and it had really changed who she was in a profound way, in that she felt she was one with this device, and it allowed her to have freedom that she'd never had before. Well, the company said, well, we're done with that trauma, we got to take it out. And she fought to not have it removed. But eventually, she was the last one in the trial, and they forced her to remove it, because they didn't have funding to maintain its care. So there's things like this in regulation that are going to be problematic that we got to sort out.
If I can move to a positive, I'm an optimist, but not really in a trial, but I think that where we are headed from the dementia perspective, for example, is that these kinds of approaches will give people living with dementia, particularly at more advanced dementia, non-communicative individuals, it will give them more agency and autonomy and allow them to consent, because if you can read what's going on in the minds, right, and they can actually control by their mind, just as you're talking about, people who don't have the ability to move, they can actually speak and write. Yeah, I think that's where I see us headed. We have to work around all of these regulatory issues for sure.
I'm excited about space too. Don't get me wrong. I don't need to be doing it.
we have time for one more quick question. Anyone has any?
Like, this is probably a bit more of a simple question than what you've been sending off, but I have a 7 and a 10-year-old niece and nephew. They're very bright. They're surrounded by people who are leaders within the tech community in Canada. Government, not government, professionals, you name it, own businesses. They already say, my body, my brain. So what can academia and business do together, and the law, to speed this up? Because my 7 and 10-year-old niece and nephew, they're not waiting for us to figure this piece out. They're kind of figuring it out earlier than what we can keep up with. So how do we manage this? How do we get there quicker?
There's something to be said about civics education, but also education at the early ages, right? That we didn't have to worry about. I didn't have. My kids at like 3 can use an iPad. I was not allowed to go near anything like that, right? For a long. So their world is so different. We have to have those conversations for a conference, and maybe next year or year after, or whatever. Those conversations have to be had about when do we start educating children about these complex things, so that they can have the language used to express those things. But I think coming back to our keynote too, there's a sense in which you can't, as a parent, rely on the government to get there before you get there as a parent. And the law is kind of like the fence around the outside of the playing surface. It keeps us from going too far in some directions. But there's a whole lot of space on there that we have to navigate interpersonally with ourselves and with our families and with our communities, and do good that the law shouldn't have a role in and doesn't have a role in. And maybe eventually it will have a role in, right, when it sets the parameters by which we can engage. But when your kids get there before the government gets there, it's not a bad thing. It's just make sure that we have these spaces to have conversations about what we're learning from our kids, about where our government needs to get, right? So kudos to you for having smart children.
They're not mine, they're my sister's.
I mean, yeah, well, having smart children in your family. But I'm not so sure the law is always the answer.
I have in the other way around. I think one of the things about augmentation, like let's say that we have a neurostimulation modality that emerges and it can actually help your kids get better test scores so they can get into med school. You can just imagine all the wealthy Toronto moms, tiger moms of the private school sector who will be having their kids be put first in line for that. Now, do we want to do that? Should we allow that? Like, it sort of gets at what you're saying about my body, my brain. Sorry.
Felicity Huffman. You need to go on TMZ more.
Oh, what are the actors? Oh, that.
Okay. Well, I want to thank people who have asked such intriguing and important questions, and thanks to the audience, and especially to our panelists and our organizers in PINA. And with that, we're leading you to
Yes, we have a break now. So we
So
have
thank you very much.